She had given everything. Every piece of her heart, every ounce of her loyalty, every dream she thought they were supposed to chase together. Loving him wasn't a choice, it had felt like fate, like something bigger than either of them. And she had held onto that love with both hands, believing in it, in him, in the future they were supposed to build. But love isn't always enough. The warning signs had been there, hidden beneath pretty words and empty promises. She ignored them, convinced that what they had was worth fighting for. He was her world, and she had been willing to endure the storms, to forgive the disappointments, to shrink herself if it meant keeping them together. And then, just like that, it was over. She hadn't seen it coming, not like this, maybe deep down. She had known he wasn't who she had convinced herself he was. But she hadn't been prepared for how easily he had let go, how little hesitation there had been when he walked away. No explanations, no remorse, just the cold reality that she had spent years loving someone who had never valued her the same way. The pain was unbearable, at first the kind that keeps you awake at night, that makes everything feel too heavy, too overwhelming. She had spent so much time building a life around him that she wasn't sure who she was without him. But while he had been quick to move on, expecting her to fade into the background like a chapter closed and forgotten, she had been left with no choice but to rewrite her story. And that's exactly what she did. At first, it was just about survival, picking up the pieces, forcing herself to get through the day. But something shifted. The heartbreak that once weighed her down became fuel. The love she had poured into him, she started pouring it into herself, into her dreams, into proving no, reminding herself that she was always meant for more. Now, she was unstoppable. The world that had once felt so small, so tied to him, was suddenly wide open. The dreams she had put on hold were no longer waiting in the shadows. She was chasing them. No, she was conquering them. Opportunities that once seemed out of reach were now within her grasp, not because anyone handed them to her, but because she had fought for them. And him? He was nothing more than a name she used to say with love, now just a footnote in her journey. She didn't need to look back. There was nothing left for her in the past. Because while he had walked away thinking she would never recover, she had done more than that. She was winning. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for someone else to see her worth. She already knew it, and that changed everything. That first morning after he left was the hardest. She woke up expecting to hear his voice, half thinking she'd see him standing in the doorway like nothing had changed. But the silence was loud, deafening in a way that made her stomach twist. The bed felt too big, the air too still, as if even the walls of their home knew something was missing. She sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in her mind. Was there a moment she could have changed? A word she could have said differently? A way she could have held on just a little tighter? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that none of it would have mattered. He had already made up his mind, long before he told her. Maybe he had made it up, even before she ever saw the signs. The first few days blurred together. She went through the motions, getting up, getting dressed, pretending to eat, but nothing felt real. The world outside was still moving, people laughing, talking, living, as if nothing had happened. And maybe to them, nothing had. But to her, everything had changed. Then came the whispers. She hadn't expected people to talk about it, but of course they did. They always do, the pitying looks, the hushed conversations that stopped the second she walked into the room. Some of them pretended to care, offering empty words that only made her feel worse. Others were cruel in their curiosity, wanting to know every painful detail, as if her heartbreak was just another story to gossip about. And him? He wasn't suffering. He wasn't heartbroken. He was fine. Better than fine, actually. Moving on so fast it made her head spin. As if she had been nothing more than a stepping stone, a temporary pause in his life, before something better came along. She saw the pictures, heard the stories, and with every new detail, The weight in her chest grew heavier. But then, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden moment of clarity. No dramatic realization, just a slow, quiet change. She was tired of feeling like she had lost everything, when the truth was, she still had herself. And that had to mean something. She started small, simple things. Waking up without letting the grief pull her back under. Taking deep breaths instead of letting the sadness win. Going for walks, feeling the wind against her skin, reminding herself that the world was still beautiful, even if it felt different now. Then came the bigger steps. She picked up the dreams she had put aside for him. The ones she had convinced herself could wait. The ones he had said weren't realistic, weren't practical. She worked harder than ever, pouring herself into something she could control. The pain became fuel, the loss became motivation. Every time she felt like breaking down, she pushed forward instead. And slowly, things began to change. People noticed. The same ones who had whispered about her heartbreak were now whispering about something else. About how she was different, stronger. About how she was doing things no one expected, including him. Because one day, he did notice. Maybe it was a picture he saw, or something someone told him. Maybe it was just a feeling. But he realized too late, of course, that the woman he left behind wasn't the same one he had walked away from. And for the first time, he was the one looking back. She didn't notice at first. She was too focused, too determined to keep moving forward. But the world had a way of circling back, of making sure unresolved things never stayed buried for too long. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't about her pain. They were about him. About how he was watching, noticing, asking questions. Someone mentioned seeing him pause a little too long on a picture of her. Someone else said he had asked about her in passing, like he wasn't really asking, just casually slipping her name into conversations. But nothing about it was casual. At first, she ignored it. She told herself it didn't matter, that it didn't change anything. But a part of her, small, buried, but still, there felt something when she heard. Not longing. Not regret. Just a quiet, undeniable satisfaction. She had spent so long thinking she had lost, that he had won. That she had been the one left behind, while he moved on without a second thought. But now the story had shifted. She kept going, pushing further. Every day, she built something new: opportunities, successes, connections. The life she had once imagined having with him was nothing compared to the one she was creating on her own. But with success came new challenges. Not everyone was happy to see her rise. There were those who had doubted her from the start, the ones who thought she would crumble under the weight of what had happened. And now that she wasn't just surviving but thriving, they watched with suspicion, with envy. And then there were those who had always expected her to fail. The ones who had never believed in her dreams, who thought she was chasing something too big, too impossible. They whispered too, but this time with a different kind of edge. They waited for her to stumble. They wanted her to. And she felt it. The pressure, the weight of it all. The constant need to prove herself. The expectations, both spoken and unspoken, pressing in on her from every direction. There were nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the exhaustion settle deep in her bones. But she never let it show. She smiled when she needed to, held her head high, moved with purpose. And still, the past lurked just beneath the surface, because he wasn't just watching from a distance anymore. He was closer than she realized. A chance encounter, a moment she hadn't planned for, brought them face to face again. And in that instant, she saw it, the recognition in his eyes. The quiet understanding that the person standing in front of him wasn't the woman he had left behind. She was more. And that realization? It was only the beginning. She told herself it didn't matter. That seeing him again was nothing more than a moment, a fleeting second that held no real weight. But deep down, she knew better. The past had a way of slipping through the cracks, no matter how tightly she sealed them. And now it was staring her in the face, making her question things she thought she had long buried. His presence lingered in the background, subtle at first. A familiar name mentioned in passing. A glance exchanged across a crowded room. Then, more than that, a direct conversation, unexpected and charged with something unspoken. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was trying to understand, to piece together how she had gone from the woman he left behind to the one standing in front of him now, untouchable, unstoppable. But she had no answers to give him, because she wasn't looking back. Not for him. Not for anyone. Yet the world seemed determined to test her resolve. Opportunities came, bigger than anything she had imagined. Doors that had once been closed were now wide open, waiting for her to step through. But with them came pressure expectations that weighed on her shoulders like heavy chains. There were people who supported her, who believed in her, but there were also those who waited for her to fail. Those who whispered that she had only come this far by luck, that she wasn't strong enough to keep going. And then there was him. No longer just a ghost from her past, he was suddenly there, present in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just chance meetings anymore. He was showing up, asking questions, making it clear that whatever had once been broken between them, he was starting to feel the weight of it. And for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Regret. But it was too late for that. She wasn't the same. The woman he had walked away from had been uncertain, lost in the idea of love, believing it was the most important thing in the world. But now she knew better. She had built something greater than love. She had built herself. And yet, there was no denying the tension, the slow unraveling of everything she thought she had already put behind her. Because the past didn't just stay in the past, and she was about to find out just how much power it still held over her. She told herself she had moved past it, that nothing could shake the foundation she had built. But life had a way of testing even the strongest walls, and the cracks were beginning to show. He wasn't just watching from the sidelines anymore. He was stepping into her world, forcing her to acknowledge his presence in ways she never intended. At first, it was subtle, an email forwarded through mutual contacts, an unexpected collaboration that put them in the same room. Then, it became unavoidable. He was there, showing up at the same events, finding reasons to speak to her, as if trying to remind her of a version of herself she had long since abandoned. And then came the moment that changed everything. A business deal, one she had poured everything into, was suddenly slipping from her grasp. Investors were hesitating, and whispers of doubt spread like wildfire. At first, she thought it was the usual resistance, the same battles she had been fighting since she stepped into this world. But then, she found out the truth. Someone had been working against her from the shadows, feeding doubts, twisting narratives, making sure she faced resistance at every turn. She traced it back, followed the quiet trail of betrayals, and when she finally reached the end of it, she couldn't believe what she found. It was him. Not directly, not in a way that could be proven outright, but the evidence was there. People connected to him. Deals influenced by his words. Decisions shaped by his carefully placed doubts. And the worst part? It wasn't clear why. Was it revenge? Regret? A desperate attempt to pull her back into his orbit. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. Not because she doubted herself, but because she hadn't expected this. She had prepared for the world to challenge her. She had braced herself for every obstacle, every judgment, every attempt to bring her down. But she hadn't prepared for him. The man who once claimed to love her was now the one standing in her way. And she had no idea what he wanted. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as the weight of the betrayal settled in. The pieces had all fallen into place, every delay, every sudden shift in negotiations, every hesitation from potential investors. He had been pulling strings behind the scenes, casting doubt on her abilities, making sure she faced more resistance than ever. But why? She refused to let anger cloud her judgment. This was a game, and if he thought he could manipulate the board, he had underestimated her. She had built herself from the ground up, brick by brick, after he had left her with nothing. No matter how hard he tried to shake her foundation, she wasn't going to crumble now. So she did what she did best. She fought back. Instead of confronting him directly, she took control of the narrative. If he wanted to play in the shadows, she would bring everything into the light. Every connection he had used against her, every whisper of doubt he had spread, it was time to turn them against him. She reached out to her network, people who had supported her from the beginning. She strengthened old alliances, secured new deals, and made it clear that she was not backing down. And just as she expected, the tide began to turn. The investors who had been hesitant started reconsidering. The voices that had doubted her began to shift. The more she pushed forward, the more his influence started to crack. Then came the final blow, the one he never saw coming. She exposed the truth. Not through a public spectacle, not in a way that would destroy him, but in a way that left him with no room to maneuver. She let key people in the industry see exactly what had been happening, let them realize the manipulation that had been taking place behind closed doors. And when they turned their backs on him, when the deals he had relied on started slipping away, he finally reached out to her. At first, he tried to justify it, told her it wasn't personal, that he had his own reasons, that he never wanted to hurt her. But she saw through it. She saw the regret in his eyes, the realization that he had miscalculated. He had expected her to break, to come running back, to need him in some way. Instead, she had risen above it, stronger than ever. And then, just as she was about to walk away, he said something that stopped her in her tracks. "I never wanted you to fail," he admitted, voice lower now, almost uncertain. "I just didn't know how to watch you win without me." For a brief moment, she felt something stir, a distant echo of the past, of the love she had once given so freely. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She met his gaze, unwavering. "That was never your choice to make." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him behind, not just in that moment, but for good. She walked away with her head held high, not bothering to look back. The weight of the past, the heartbreak, the betrayal, it no longer had a hold on her. She had spent too much time proving herself, too much time fighting battles she never should have had to fight. And now she was done. Not just with him, but with everything that had tried to hold her back. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. With the truth exposed, her name was stronger than ever. Investors who had once hesitated now wanted to work with her. Deals that had stalled suddenly moved forward at lightning speed. She was no longer the underdog fighting to be taken seriously. She was the one calling the shots now. But with success came decisions, and she had to choose what really mattered. She had built something incredible, but she didn't want to lose herself in the process. So, she took a step back and reassessed everything. She let go of partnerships that didn't align with her vision, focused on the projects that truly inspired her, and made sure that every move she made was one she believed in. She also made time for the people who had stood by her. The friends who had supported her when she had nothing, the ones who had never questioned her worth. She strengthened those relationships, knowing that success meant nothing if she had no one to share it with. And then one evening, she found herself standing on the balcony of her new office, looking out over the city. She had made it. Not because of revenge, not because she wanted to prove something to him, but because she had always been capable. Because she had refused to let anyone tell her what she could or couldn't do. She heard his name a few times after that. People whispered about how he had lost deals, how his influence had faded. But she didn't care. His story was no longer part of hers. He was a chapter she had closed, a lesson she had learned. One day, she received a message from him. A simple one. "I see you winning. I hope you're happy." She stared at it for a moment before deleting it without responding. She didn't need his validation. She had already won.